Greetings, and welcome to this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Meno. Two surprising things happen near the middle of the Meno. Meno, abruptly, in the middle of a sentence, withdraws from his common inquiry with Socrates into what is virtue, and reverts to his original question, is virtue teachable? The other thing that happens is that Meno's guest friend, i.e. his host in Athens, Anytus, sits down to listen. If we're to understand the Meno, we must try to understand the relation between these two events. But first, who are these characters? Meno is a young, handsome, and rich foreigner. He is also a politically ambitious, very bad man, who soon after this dialogue meets a very bad end. Anytus is an Athenian politician, and soon after this dialogue he is one of the three accusers who persuade the Athenian assembly to bring Socrates to a very bad end. Socrates spends the first half of the dialogue making a mockery of Meno. After Anytus arrives, Socrates spends the second half of the dialogue, which Anytus is witness to, antagonizing Anytus. These are the people that Socrates speaks with and the way he treats them in the Platonic dialogue on virtue. By his choice of this dramatic frame, Plato teaches us that the topic of virtue is political and that it is a matter of life and death. Now, the dialogue itself falls into two equal parts, two halves. In the first half, Socrates directs Meno to the primary question, what is virtue? After all, how can we say whether virtue is teachable if we don't know what it is? Meno gives Socrates three answers to this question. First, he says that the virtues of different people at different times of life are relative to the work that each of us must do. Second, Meno singles out a particular work as virtue, rule over human beings. Third, Meno says that virtue is the goal of that work, enjoying beautiful things, which he amends to the ability to procure for oneself the good things. Now, Socrates contends that Meno's answers fail because they give lists of virtues rather than say what is common to them all as virtue. Now, this is not fair. Socrates could have helped Meno sharpen his answers, while still letting Meno see that his basic definition of virtue, as doing your proper work for the city, retains crucial ambiguities. But instead he numbs Meno, as Meno complains. Perhaps then it's no surprise that Meno attacks Socrates, likening him to the torpedo fish. Socrates accepts the likeness if it means that he numbs himself too, since he says that he does not know what virtue is. Meno replies, how can anyone search for what he doesn't know? In response, Socrates tells the famous story that the soul is immortal, and that in its eternity it sees all things, forgets them, and then recollects them. To prove this point, Socrates shows that Meno's own slave boy, who's never studied geometry, can recollect how to double a given square. Socrates' account is very fanciful. His leading questions to the slave boy hardly prove that the boy knew geometry in a past life, much less that his soul is immortal. Yet the charm works for Meno. Perhaps Socrates is showing, to his friends who are watching, the immortal longings that motivate a man such as Meno, and his confused understanding of virtue. This is roughly the midpoint of the dialogue. Now, this is where Meno agrees to continue the inquiry with Socrates and then immediately withdraws his agreement. Meno demands instead that Socrates return to the original question, is virtue teachable? Why does he do this? My hypothesis is that Meno has just noticed his powerful host, Anytus, sit down to listen. Meno's been embarrassed by Socrates. He's just the sort of man who would enjoy some payback. Did he hope to get that payback by challenging Socrates in front of Anytus on this notorious point, is virtue teachable? Meno likely knew the arguments that the sophists used to run down civic fathers as being unable to teach their sons virtue. And lo and behold, Socrates deploys this very sophistic argument against Anytus himself. Did Socrates notice Meno's change, understand it, and rather than evade, decide to use the entree to antagonize Anytus? Why would Socrates do that? I'll come back to that question in a moment. In the second half of the dialogue, Meno and Socrates first agree that virtue is a sort of practical knowledge, prudence, or phronesis, as they call it. But then, first with Anytus and after with Meno, Socrates proceeds to argue that there are no teachers of virtue, and so no students, and so virtue cannot be knowledge, but instead must be correct opinion, allotted by the gods to political men. Socrates' arguments here are most unfair. For example, his supposed proof that great politicians fail to teach their sons their virtue ignores the likelihood that their sons fail to inherit their nature, that is, their great abilities. Likewise, his rejection of the sophists as teachers of virtue relies on Anytus's prejudices and Meno's limited experience. As for his suggestion that virtue is divinely allotted correct opinion, it may appear to offer solace for those politicians, including Anytus, whom Socrates has embarrassed by revealing their ignorance. But does it really help? One can imagine Anytus saying to himself, "Great, Socrates says I'm not a total fool, I'm divinely inspired." It may even lead Anytus to wonder, does this Socrates even believe in the gods? So why would Socrates do this? Why would he converse publicly, for a second day in a row, as he notes, with the morally dubious Meno about virtue? Why would he then antagonize Meno's powerful host, Anytus? The most striking thing about this dialogue about virtue is that Socrates twice denies that he knows what virtue is at all, or even that he has ever met anyone who does. Socrates is an old man who has studied this topic since his youth. If by virtue he means the common decency that parents teach their children, his denial would be monstrous. Socrates can't be ignorant of this. So it must mean that he denies that it is virtue. And that means he knows something about virtue. Certainly he knows the right questions to ask. Indeed, he seems to know quite a lot about virtue, even if he says that he does not know what virtue is altogether. I think then that in the Meno, Plato shows us Socrates' virtue, at work in a decisive moment. He shows us Socrates' ability to use others in arguments, to be sure. But he also shows us here that Socrates quite consciously chose how to live and how to die. That is, how to set in motion the manner of his end. In this way, the Meno is properly read as leading to the events that result in the Apology. It depicts a moment of decision in the drama of the Socratic life. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Meno.